supremacy, white supremacists, the relationship between that and gun violence and the promotion of guns, the NRA and Wayne LaPierre's anti-Semitism and all this kind of stuff. I want to dig a little deeper into this. On the line with us are Professor Marcia Pally, who wrote the book White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism, How Did We Get Here? And Professor Pamela Cooper-White, who wrote the book The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Why People Are Drawn In and How to Talk Across the Divide. And the P. Cooper-White at UT, well, that's an email address. Oh, here we are, Marcia Pally, MarciaPally.com, and then the other website is utsnyc.edu. Professor Pally and Professor Cooper-White, thank you both for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Professor Pally. Where are we at with regard to white evangelicals, right-wing populism? I mean, to what extent has what was once considered a fringe movement in the United States become mainstream? And what kind of threat does it represent to this republic?
Hi. Yes, so I'll start with very briefly 2 statistics, and then we want to get into the big why question. At the moment, 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants qualify as either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, and more than half of the Republicans are classified as adherents or sympathizers as well. We could go on with a lot of statistics, and they're very important, but we want to dig, as you say, deeper today. What is Christian nationalism doing for all these adherents and sympathizers? Why do they see it as the best political stance? I begin my work from comparative populism. Christian nationalism is a subset of populism. So what's that? Populism begins with duress. Could be economic, but it could also be way of life factors, changes in technology, gender roles, productivity, demographics, the feeling that the world is less fair than it used to be and that it should be. This prods something called us-them shift. It's a natural psychological move. We all do it. Under duress, we split the world into us, who is in danger, and them, the ostensible sources of the danger. This gives us an explanation for why things are going wrong, provides a way to fight back, a way to be effective on one's own behalf, and a community to fight with you. Ironically, this holds even if you pick the wrong them, the wrong target. Even when you've chosen a them who is not the source of the original duress, and that's tragic, because not identifying the correct source of the duress leaves the duress in place. Pamela Cooper-White is going to go more into the psychology of right-wing populism and Christian nationalism, but we need to answer one more question first, which is how do we identify them? Who do we target as the sources of our duress? And that comes from our history and cultural background, our familiar targets. In America, our classic targets are government and outsiders, new immigrants and people of color. And this is part of our history. America was settled by those fleeing oppressive governments, politically, economic, religiously oppressive, suspicion of government and other outsiders who would disturb local communities is baked into the American DNA. The Puritan Compact was organized for a government of Massachusetts, but also to constrain non-Puritan, here comes that word, outsiders. Mm-hmm. White evangelicals have a double dose of these. They fled the same political and economic oppression in Europe that the ancestors of many Americans did, but they were also the religiously oppressed group of Europe, exiled and persecuted by both Protestant and Catholic governments. So we have duress, we have us-them shift targeting government and outsiders as the thems, and duress turns the strengths of America into weaknesses. Us-them shift under duress weakens our ability to distinguish between oppressive government and government per se. All government programs look suspect. And community building, a great source of American development and strength, becomes exclusionary and defensive. This irony can be tapped into and animated. Look at what Trump went after. He went after big government, the Washington, D.C. swamp, and its associated elites in so-called fake news. And he went after our classic outsiders, people of color, the wall against Latin American migrants, the Muslim ban. Fighting these familiar thems can make one feel effective and proud. People are willing to fight very hard for the guy that they feel is fighting for them. We need look only to the January 6th riot and 71% of Christian nationalist adherents who view Trump favorably today.
Yep.
So what I did in my book, and I'm going to throw the ball to Pam in just a second, was to explain how this history and political culture impacts America today, focusing on the last half century to explain why Christian nationalism is benefiting those who believe in it. Because until we understand how the world looks from someone else's perspective, we can't talk to them and we can't move forward. Here's the bridge to Pamela Cooper White. In 2016, Tony Perkins, president of the Conservative Christian Family Research Council, gave some sense of the defensive fight that white evangelicals felt is at hand. He said, evangelicals are, I'm quoting now, tired of being kicked around by Barack Obama and his leftists, and are finally glad that there's somebody on the playground that is willing to punch the bully.
Okay. Professor Pamela Cooper White, your thoughts on this and the psychology that underlies it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having both of us. Marcia and I have talked about how many ways in which from different disciplines we have aligned on a lot of these ideas. And particularly to the psychology underlying this. In my book, I talk about conscious motivations and unconscious motivations, and I can just outline basically what those are. Conscious motivations, which a person maybe wouldn't describe in the language I'm going to use, but would agree in principle that what I'm describing is something that they know that they believe, as opposed to unconscious motivations where the person doesn't really know what's coming up inside of them that is also animating some of their emotional attachment to this conservative movement.
Right.
So conscious motivations, one very big one Marcia mentioned in passing is belonging. Everyone has a need for belonging. And for at least a couple of decades now, there's been a fair amount of sociological research about how people feel isolated and alienated, and where do you go to find other people? Robert Bella's book, Bowling Alone. And so finding a group in which you have this heightened sense of purpose. So a politically right-wing, theologically conservative evangelical church, particularly these mega churches, but also churches that are smaller but emulate their style of worship, which is very compelling and very exciting to people. It gives them a sense of, now I have a community. Now I have people that I can be with who share my views. And when you blend a certain distorted version, I would say, of Christianity with the politics, which are really driving much of this in terms of leaders' quest for power, now we've got a moral battle of good versus evil to engage in. So it even heightens that sense of belonging with a moral purpose. And that's a very compelling thing for many people, particularly who have felt like underdogs in society. Going to the underdog argument, another conscious motivation is the fear of loss of white social status. The U.S. Census Bureau predicts, in fact, that in the year 2042, it will be the end of a white majority population in the United States. And while many of us would welcome that as a sign of diversity and enrichment of culture in America, there are many who feel existentially threatened by that right. They feel like the one thing that gave them some purchase in power in American society is being taken away.
Right.
And that includes the fear of immigrants, jobs going to foreigners, which is statistically not as great as people fear. And that also combines with a fear of loss of, we could call it patriarchy, although most of the people who are Christian nationalists, except for the leaders, really are not in charge of much of anything, but they fear the loss of male privilege.
Right.
And that is reinforced in conservative Christian circles by a notion of male headship, both in the home as the head of the family and in public.
Yeah.
And
Professor Cooper, I'm sorry, we only have a minute left here before we hit a break that I can't control.
okay.
What do we do about this, Professor Cooper-White?
Well, that's a big leap. I think what we have to do is two-pronged. I think one thing we have to do is learn how to talk to people who have gone down the rabbit hole, particularly the extreme being conspiracy theories, and half of white evangelical Protestants agree with QAnon now. We have to talk with the people that we know where there's some openness to have a conversation and plant seeds of questioning what they've been hearing all along, if they're open to any kind of dialogue with us. And at the same time, we do need to be doing education, writing op-eds, getting out in the public so that people who are, for example, progressive Christians also have a voice in the public square, which has been so dominated by the conservative voice.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and this is a big challenge. We've been speaking with Professor Marcia Pally, who wrote White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism, How Did We Get Here? And Professor Pamela Cooper-White, who was just speaking, who wrote The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Why People Are Drawn In and How to Talk Across the Divide. I highly recommend both books. Professor Pally, Professor Cooper-White, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's great talking with you. We'll be back. It's 18 minutes past the hour.